let's continue our discussion of how oxygen is transported in the blood with the next section of Costanza's respiratory physiology chapter. Remember, we're talking about things that shift the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right or to the left. Shifts to the right occur when there's decreased affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. The decrease in affinity reflects an increase in the P50, meaning that 50% saturation is achieved at a higher than normal value of PO2. When affinity is decreased, this is facilitating unloading of oxygen into those peripheral tissues. The factors that cause this decrease in affinity and a right shift of the curve are understandable. In each case, it makes sense during these scenarios to facilitate the unloading of oxygen to the peripheral tissues. If we get an increase in PCO2 or a decrease in pH, sometimes I think about this as an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration. This occurs when the metabolic activity of those tissues increases. We have an increasing CO2 production. Increases in tissue CO2 cause increases in hydrogen ion concentration, therefore a decrease in pH. These effects together decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, shifting the curve to the right, increasing the P50. All of it facilitates in metabolically active tissues the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. You can think about this as ensuring increased oxygen delivery in the case of exercising skeletal muscle. The effect of PCO2 and pH on the oxygen hemoglobin curve is called the Bohr effect. Increases in temperature also cause this right shift in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, increases in the P50, and facilitate unloading of oxygen to the peripheral tissues. It also makes sense for the exercising skeletal muscle example. As we're working, as our muscles are producing heat, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right, meaning those muscles that are producing heat are going to be able to take more oxygen. More of it's going to be given up by hemoglobin. Increases in 2,3-DPG also facilitate a shift to the right. 2,3-DPG is a byproduct of glycolysis in red blood cells. The 2,3-DPG binds to the beta chains of deoxyhemoglobin and reduces their affinity for oxygen. This decrease in affinity once again shifts the curve to the right, facilitating the unloading of oxygen to the peripheral tissues. We increase our 2,3-DPG production under hypoxic conditions. So if we're living at high altitude, which causes hypoxemia, that's going to stimulate the production of 2,3-DPG in red blood cells. These increased levels of 2,3-DPG are going to facilitate the delivery of oxygen to the tissues as an adaptive measurement to that hypoxemia of altitude. Shifts in the oxygen hemoglobin curve to the left occur when there's an increased affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, associated with a decrease in the P50, meaning that the 50% saturation point of hemoglobin occurs at a lower than normal value of PO2. So when the affinity is increased, unloading of oxygen is more difficult. The binding of oxygen is tighter. All the arrows are going to point in the opposite direction for the shifts to the left. So decreases in the PCO2 or increases in the pH. In other words, decreases in the hydrogen ion concentration. The effect of these changes is the Bohr effect manifested once again. When there's decreased tissue metabolism, there's decreased production of carbon dioxide, decreased hydrogen ion concentration, increasing pH. All those things contribute to a left shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So, when tissues have a low demand for oxygen, oxygen is going to be more tightly bound to hemoglobin. Less of it will be unloaded to these metabolically unactive tissues. Similarly, decreases in temperature cause the opposite effect. The the curve is going to shift to the left. As tissue metabolism decreases, less heat is produced, and as less heat is produced, less oxygen is unloaded to those tissues. Decreases in 2,3-DPG concentration also cause a left shift, and they also reflect decreased tissue metabolism. As we described previously, hemoglobin F is the fetal variant of hemoglobin, with the beta chains replaced by gamma chains. This modification in hemoglobin produces an increased affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, a left shift of the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve, and a decreased P50. The mechanism of this left shift is based on the binding of 2,3-DPG. 2,3-DPG does not bind quite as avidly to the gamma chains of hemoglobin F as it does to the beta chains of hemoglobin A. So with less 2,3-DPG bound, the affinity for oxygen increases, and this increased affinity is beneficial to the fetus, whose PaO2 is low, about 40 millimeters of mercury. Now let's take the example of carbon monoxide. All of the examples that we've described thus far have involved a shift of the curve to the right or to the left. But the effect of carbon monoxide is different because it decreases oxygen-bound hemoglobin and also causes a left shift in the curve. This is shown in figure 523, which is on the bottom of page 214 in your text. Carbon monoxide binds hemoglobin at the same site as oxygen, but it binds it with an affinity that's 250 times that of oxygen, and we form a molecule known as carboxyhemoglobin. So when the partial pressure of carbon monoxide is only 1/250th of oxygen, equal amounts of carbon monoxide and oxygen will bind to hemoglobin. Since oxygen can't bind to the heme groups that are taken up by carbon monoxide spots, the presence of carbon monoxide decreases the number of oxygen binding sites available on hemoglobin. In the example shown in figure 523, hemoglobin bound to oxygen is reduced by at least 50%, meaning that half of the binding sites would be bound by carbon monoxide, and only half of them would be available for oxygen. Obviously, this is going to have disastrous implications for oxygen transport. This alone would reduce oxygen content in the blood and oxygen delivery to the tissues by 50%. But carbon monoxide also causes a left shift in the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. So those heme groups that are not bound by carbon monoxide actually have an increased affinity for oxygen. So the P50 is decreased, making it more difficult for oxygen to be unloaded in the peripheral tissues. These two effects combine to have catastrophic effects for oxygen delivery to the tissues. There's reduced oxygen binding capacity, but also the remaining heme sites bind oxygen more tightly. We're going to illustrate with the case shown in box 5.1 on the top of page 215 in your text. So on a cold February morning in Boston, a 55-year-old man gets the bright idea he's going to warm up his car in the garage. While he's doing this, he's waiting in the workshop adjacent to his garage. 30 minutes later, his wife finds him tinkering at his workbench, confused, breathing rapidly, probably muttering something about the Red Sox. He's taken to a nearby emergency room and is given 100% oxygen to breathe. We get the following arterial blood gas back. He's got an arterial O2 of 660, an arterial CO2 of 36, a pH of 7.43, and his percent O2 saturation of hemoglobin is listed at 60%. What's going on here? The man likely inhaled exhaust fumes from his auto and is suffering from acute carbon monoxide poisoning. The arterial blood values obtained can be explained by the effects of carbon monoxide to the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. The carbon monoxide binds avidly to hemoglobin with an affinity that's 250 times that of oxygen binding to hemoglobin. So those heme groups that normally are bound to oxygen now are occupied by carbon monoxide. the percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is measured at 60%. So 40% of these sites must be bound by carbon monoxide. Since oxyhemoglobin is the main way we transport oxygen to the peripheral tissues, this has got a detrimental effect on the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The second detrimental effect of carbon monoxide poisoning is to shift the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to the left, reducing the P50, increasing the affinity of hemoglobin for what little oxygen is bound. So it's more difficult to drop this oxygen off in the tissues. And these two effects combine to result in death by failure to deliver sufficient oxygen to critical tissues such as the brain. The only treatment for this would be to have the patient breathe 100% oxygen in an effort to rapidly displace as much carbon monoxide as possible from the hemoglobin. Now, notice he had a strikingly high arterial O2 at 660 millimeters of mercury. Is this value plausible? So, assuming he's got no VQ defect, his P arterial O2 should be equal to his P alveolar O2, since there's equilibration of pulmonary capillary blood within the alveolar gas. So a better question is, why is his alveolar O2 so high? We can calculate his alveolar O2 based on the alveolar gas equation. If we know the value for O2 of inspired air and the CO2 in either the alveoli or we use the artery as a reference, and we know the inspired O2 from the barometric pressure, as well as the percent O2 in inspired air. In this case, he was breathing 100%. Remember, the alveolar CO2 equals the arterial CO2. Respiratory quotient for all extensive purposes we're going to assume is 0.8. We use this for all clinical examples. So, doing the math, his inspired O2 is his atmospheric pressure minus water vapor times the FiO2. 760 minus 47 times 100%. So the inspired O2 is 713. To get the alveolar O2, we have to subtract the alveolar CO2 divided by the respiratory quotient. For alveolar CO2, we use the arterial CO2. So 713 minus 36 over 0.8 gives us an alveolar O2 of 668 millimeters of mercury. And if we assume that the systemic arterial blood has the same O2 as alveolar gas, and the VQ ratios are normal, then the measured value of 660 is consistent with the expected alveolar O2 of 668. The patient has a very small or physiologic A gradient. That concludes our discussion of how oxygen is transported